How many of you, like my wife, grew up in a house where, on occasion, Dad spanked? My wife tells the story that her mom never spanked, but she would say, "You wait till your dad gets home, and that's when it's going to happen." So she tells the story of stuffing magazines in her pants, as if her parents were such, dolts they couldn't figure out that the back end of their child was never shaped like that in the past as they came to give us back. What I know is that we are living in a time when people make equivalent the word love and tolerance. Because the idea that we have shaped, and I don't know how we did it, the idea that we have misshapen in the hearts of those that we're bringing up is that if I love you, I will always let you do what you want. But you don't have to get past the age of 2 to realize that when you see that beautiful, shiny object that you want to play with and the parent takes it away, that's not cruelty, that's a knife. And it's going to hurt you. And so sometimes, have we all gotten to the place where we realize sometimes we just can't get what we want because what we want isn't what we should have? I want to talk this morning from Zechariah 12. I want to do 2 things. First, I want to make sure that those who are, let's say, 30 years old and younger, don't tune out right now. Because if I would have listened to the verses that we just read, and I would have looked at what God said a long time ago, 520 years before Jesus, about how he was going to raise up Jerusalem, I would have been thinking something like, I wonder what I'm doing later this afternoon. Don't tune out. Because God has a message that he wants to speak to people. In a world that believes that love only lets people do what they want, God wants you to know he loves his people intensely and therefore will bring about a great tribulation. Trouble is coming to a person who needs to find God but cannot because their neck is so stiff. The second thing I want to say is that if you did a little ramp up here, you would see that God has a strong arm. The strong arm of the Lord is involved in your life. God was involved in your life before you ever knew how to say God. God was involved in your life 3 generations before you were a glint in anybody's eye. He has been a part of your life long before you knew him, and he was already moving the board around, placing the pieces in line before you ever had recognition of it. God isn't waiting for man to make moves so that he knows what to do next. He doesn't poll to figure out what's moral. Now, we're smiling because we know that there are people who do that. What do we do next? Well, let's take a poll. God doesn't do it that way. The long arm of the Lord is involved in your life. I want you to know that there are a team of people that we train in the United States. Joe and John are 2 guys I know who were trained in the most elite squad of black ops that the personnel has ever been trained in the United States. And I can tell you this, that team is able to go anywhere at the behest of the President of the United States when ordered to do so. He never knows what's next, and he can't tell you what he did yesterday. What I know about him is this. To get to where he is, his body was nearly broken by the disciplined training. Now, he could have rung the bell and got out right at the beginning and said, "This is mean, you're making me run too much." But actually, all of the training he went through was because there was going to come a day when he was going to need to have the body reflex respond. In the same way, discipline works both in a child and in an athlete and in a soldier. Discipline works in order to build and break and build. That's what it does. Now, if you've been following this series, you probably know that if you read Zechariah up till now, Zechariah means God remembers, Zichra Yahu. And actually, chapter 10 was all about a call to salvation. So flip back for just a second. I just want you to kind of put your finger through it as we go through. And remember that God gave a call to salvation to his people. And he said this. He said, "I want to make a request of you. Ask from me the things that you need." the source that you need, the rainfall that you need. Because when you don't do that in verse 2 of chapter 10, you tend to ask somebody else. We are made to desire advice. Oprah made a living out of this. We are made to want somebody else to tell us about their problems and make them like our problems and give us solutions. We go on the web because we want to know about other people's experiences that somehow will help us understand our own experiences. And so God says, listen, come to me and ask me for what you need, because when you don't ask me, you end up asking teraphim. You end up asking soothsayers. You're going to get advice from somebody. Would you get it from me since I built everything? And then after the request, he said, I want you to know something in verse 3 of chapter 10. I have an indictment against shepherds, bad leaders, spiritual and political, that are leading you in the wrong way. Make no mistake about this, men and women, God holds leaders at a higher standard than he holds the rest of the community. And where leadership goes south, the community follows. In verse 4, he goes on and says, I also have some promises. I got a request. I got an indictment, but I've got some promises. And the promises include a cornerstone in verse 4. See, here's what he says. I'm going to build a new building. I'm going to send you a new cornerstone, and I'm going to make a new society. Israel, I want you to know, I'm going to send you a cornerstone that's going to start a whole new thing. And when it starts building, that building will become great and strong and powerful. That might of that building will be the Messiah himself. In verse 5, he says, I'm going to give new might to Israel. In verses 6 and 7, he says, I'm going to renew the vigor of Israel's return. I'm going to bring back people in the first settlement, and they're going to grow. And then in verse 8, 9, 10, 11, he says, I'm going to whistle to the Jews from around the world, and I'm going to start pulling them back in, and they're going to start coming in. And then in verse 12, it says, there's going to be an eventual salvation to the people of Israel. And you go, hallelujah, what a great story. What a great story. See, this is a story about how God starts with Messiah and draws his people back, and then Messiah reigns, and it's all good, and I was doing so well, and then chapter 11 shows up. I was having such a good time. And chapter 11 shows up and says in the first 4 verses that I'm going to break the back of the economy of the Jewish people. What? You just told me all these great promises in 10. He said, yeah, now a little interlude. In order for me to get you to the blessing, I got to take you through the wilderness. See, we're all about the promised land. We're all about just take me to the promised land. You know, the problem is to get from Egypt in the world to the promised land that God has, you got to go through the wilderness. I just want to get from one to the other. I'm not a guy who wants to waste a lot of time in the wilderness. I don't like camels that much. I spent a lot of time with them. I walked the Sinai Desert. I'm not kidding. I've walked that trail 100 times. I know every curve in the road. I have no interest in doing it again, and I really don't want to do it at this time of year. And here's what I can tell you. None of us want to talk about the hard stuff. So chapter 10 says, isn't this wonderful? Chapter 11 says, yeah, but there's this little thing I got to talk about. There's going to be some trouble along the way. Honestly, if I knew how hard it was going to be to raise children, I think I'll just leave that sentence hang out there. I love my kids. They're wonderful. You have no family on earth laughs like we do when we get together. They're lunatics, all 3 of them. They get it from their mother. I sit there and they watch these YouTubes, and I go, there are brain cells leaking out of my head as I'm watching this. What are you doing with this? Here's what I know, though. I know that to get him to the point where we've been laughing, there was a lot of crying. Anybody want to say amen to that one? Here's what I know in verses 5 to 7 of chapter 11. I hate spankings, but God says some prophetic voices are going to raise up, and some leaders are going to be raised up, but they're not good. And in verse 8 of chapter 11, he says some leaders will be broken in succession. And in chapter 11, verses 13 to 17, he says, I'm going to take my people. They're going to be broken. They're going to be enslaved. They're going to be crushed. Leaders are going to rise among them. There's going to be problems until finally a new shepherd in verse 16 comes out. But this new shepherd will seek to destroy the people. Not a good shepherd, a bad one. Wait a minute, God. You're telling me you love me, and you're telling me I'm going to go through all this trouble? You're telling me you love me, and yet I have to go through pain and destruction and crushing and bruising? Yes. Because here's the thing God knows about me that I don't know. God knows what I need. I just know what I want. I know I want the stuff I want. How about you? I was out on the street in Fort Lauderdale some time ago. Guy came up and says, "Give me $1." I said, "Well, I can't give you any money, but I can give you some work. I've got some work." He says, "I don't want to work. I just want money." I said, "Me too. And by the way, if you find out where that line is, let me know. Come back and tell me, because I'll get in it too." We all want the results of a good marriage without the work of putting it in. We all want the results of a great community, but we don't want to have to do the work. And we all want the results of wealth, but we don't want to have to show up Monday to Friday. So here's the truth. God says, I'm going to give you what you need, not what you want. I'm going to give you what I know you must go through. I know how stiff your neck is. Now, let me stop for a minute. Isn't it fun picking on ancient Israelites? And we can call them stiff-necked all day long because we're not like that, are we? See the problem? See, if in 10, God was going to build a new relationship, and 11, God said there's going to be real trouble. When you get to 12, you should know that the big problem God is going to cause for all the nations of the world is going to be one city. He's going to make Jerusalem the symbolic problem. Jerusalem, the place that's attacked, the place that's resettled, the place that's renegotiated, the place that's contentious, the place that's troublesome, the place that's exasperating, the place that is an intractable problem for politician after politician. I'm going to make Jerusalem a real headache to the nations. And you go, well, gee, God, I can sort of see that. If you're a student of prophecy, here's what I want you to know. When you start reading chapter 12, pick up the newspaper. They're going to look like the same thing. I want you to take for a moment and go back to the beginning of chapter 12 that we were reading. I want to remind you that long before you knew it, God was at work in your life, and long before Israel ever really conceptualized that God was the one doing the work, God was at work in their lives. Now, chapter 12, 13, and 14 begin the last message of Zechariah, and it's a three-part message. The first part is that I've been guiding in the events in chapter 12. And in chapter 13, he says, false teachers have traded you, cheated you, broken you, but I'm going to rescue you with the truth. And in 14, he says, powerful destruction is going to come, and the kingdoms of this world will clash in a mortal conflict with the God of the ages and the God of Israel, and I will overturn it all. But that's for the next hour. For this one, I just want to talk about chapter 12. I want to talk about God's sovereignty in your life and God's sovereignty in the life of all of his people. See, I think the problem is that this is both a national teaching to the people of Israel, and it's also a personal teaching to the follower of God. How do I say this? God knows you. God's been watching you. He knows your name. He knows your address. He knows your passwords. He knows your internet usage. He knows your boss's middle name. He knows because he sees. He's been watching every time you cheated, every time you lied, every time you stole. Conversely, he not only knows the skeletons in your closet and all the unsurrendered and unforgiven acts and thoughts, he also knows every kind thing you ever thought. He knows every time you ever gave a loving gift to someone else. He knows. You know that God knows more about you than Google does, and that's saying something. I just want to say. He knows. Anytime you gave something anonymously and nobody saw it, God saw it. He knows. And he's been at this a lot longer than you think. See, God's not uninformed about us. The problem isn't that God doesn't know me. The problem's I'm ignorant of him. And so ultimately, I want to tell you something. Somebody's watching you. You have a divine stalker. How uncomfortable is that? But I want you to also know something. There are some principles in God's word that expose exactly how he watches, why he watches, and what he does. I'm going to call it the principles on the long arm of the Lord. And I'm going to go to verse 1, and I'm going to start off with the first of 5 principles that I think you'll see pouring out of the verses. I'm not imposing them on the verses. I think that's what the verses are there for. I think when you start off in verse 1, you start off with what's called the revelation principle. And it simply means this: I have something important to say. Look at verse 1. Just read it. It says, the burden of the Lord concerning Israel. He's talking about his people. He's talking about a people that he has loved and nurtured. And he says, I have something to say. Thus declares the Lord, who stretches out the heaven, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. And now a word from your Creator. He's not kidding. This revelation is overt. God doesn't want to be a secret in your life. We have all kinds of people in our society acting like God is playing cat and mouse games like he's hiding. If you have a Bible in your hand, would you just hold it for a minute? How many of you agree it has like a little content in it? Does it not seem like God's not hiding? The problem isn't that he's not talking, we're just not listening. And so it's overt. It's powerful. It's a heavy burden on Zechariah. And by the way, it's specific. God addressed people specifically. He didn't just say, I just want to talk. Can I just have a chat now? He said, I want to talk about Israel. Because God knows specifically who his people are and who he's addressing what to. By the way, just like he knows Israel, he knows you. When God targets a message for you, he knows exactly what it is you need to hear. I was leading a Bible study in Jerusalem. This makes me crazy, but I was leading a Bible study in Jerusalem with a group of people, and I was trying to share with them the gospel. And this one lady had been there for a number of months, and one day she called me and she said, I accepted Jesus as my Savior. I accepted Yeshua as my personal Messiah. I said, really? How did it happen? Thinking it would be this great story. She said, he helped me find my car keys. Now, you don't know that I had put some hours into some messages on justification that would make you weep. She found her car keys. You know why? Because God knows where to meet you. He knows what corner you're on. He'll meet you where he needs to meet you. And it's not all about what we all think. It's about what he's doing. By the way, God's specific revelation here is overt, but it's also appropriate. God expressed his divine right to talk. Whenever you watch Congress, like on a really, really slow day, you watch C-SPAN because virtually all the cable is out. You see them, every time they stand up and they're recognized by the chair. Does God have the right to speak into your life today? Because listen to his credentials. By the way, I stretched out the heavens, flung 1 quintillion stars in place, and I'm keeping it all there. By the way, I spun the planet Earth, that little tiny rock third from the sun. Yeah, that was me. Oh, and by the way, I put together a little dust, breathed life into it, and made man, designed him, and gave him life. So aside from the fact that you gave me life, gave me the planet I live on, and gave me the cosmos that I'm walking in, what else did you do for me today? So he says, listen, I am the one who wants to speak. Now, the established truth is that God is the Lord. Listen to Psalm 46 for a minute. Maybe this will help. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow, cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire. Cease striving and know that I am God, and I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Every now and then, God just has to say, I think you just forget who I am. I think you pray kind of hoping it's going to go past the ceiling tiles, but you need to remember who I am. I run everything. In case you're not sure, I am. I run everything. I looked around to the deepest parts of the sea. There's nobody else there. It's just me. Job, go to the highest mountain. Been there. I walk around Everest, twice a day just for fun, God says. Nobody else is there. Stop worrying that I can't accomplish what I need to accomplish. The revelation principle is this. God has something important to say. But a lot of us really don't get it. We really don't get it. Do you know that God gave you an awful lot more than you're using right now? Maybe I can say it this way. There was a little boy who was trying to pick up a rock. His dad was out in the garden, and the boy was trying to pick up a rock. It was a big rock. He was a little boy. He's just going like this, and Dad, it's too heavy. Oh, son, you can do it. No, Dad, it's too heavy. Oh, son, you can do it. Dad, it's too heavy. I can't pick it up. Son, you can do it. I'm telling you can do it. Dad, I am doing everything I possibly can. No, you're not doing everything you can possibly do. You can move that rock, son. You're not doing what I'm telling you. Move the rock. He said, I can't do it myself. Will you help me? Now you're doing what I asked you to do. You're walking around thinking you're doing everything you can do because you don't understand that I'm standing next to you. I happen to have more power than you. Ask, and you'll receive. The bottom line is that the revelation principle is given to us to remind us that God has something to say because God is there. Let me give you a second one. Get down to verse 2 because we got to get off of verse 1. We can't do the whole time on verse 1. There's a humbling principle. I think I like verse 1 more than verse 2. Am I allowed to do that? See, verse 2 is a humbling principle. Behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup. By the way, it's a cup because it receives things, and Jerusalem receives the people from outside. That causes reeling to the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Yehudah. Yehudah can be Judah. It can also be the rest of the Jews, world Jewry. So what I think he's saying is, in order for God to get the attention of the people he's reaching out to, he's going to do something dramatic, something measurable. I'm going to stick a problem right in the middle of the east, and I'm going to call it Jerusalem, and all the nations around it are going to have a big problem with Jerusalem. Maybe you heard. This is 520 BC, but maybe you heard. Honestly, if you came from Mars and landed at the UN and looked at all the resolutions, you would swear the Jews were responsible for everything, including the common cold. Don't worry about the North Koreans. They're not going to be a problem. Iran, not a piece of cake. But the Jews, they're going to ruin everybody. One resolution after another. Can anybody explain that in the human realm apart from the spiritual realm? Here's what I know. I know that you can't read this and not realize that a dozen U.S. presidents have made a great effort to try and do something about Jerusalem, and every time they do it, there's no improvement and it ruins their career. Here's what I know. I know that the text clues us into the reality that there's an anti-Jewish reaction by people that perceive Jerusalem to be the center of all kinds of problems. There's a third of the world that right now that thinks if we could just wipe the Jews off of a piece of land, there would be peace and harmony in the Middle East. Having lived a quarter of my life in the Middle East, can I just tell you that's nonsense? That's absolute nonsense. But people get away with writing it in such small rags as the New York Times. How in the world can anybody look at the world and say the real problem is the Jews? That's where the problem is. Sadly, a great many believers today also harbor that anti-Judaism and anti-Jewish sentiment. Modern European Jews sometimes even seem caught between the Islamist blood libels and the Christian replacement theology today. By the way, we come by it honestly. You understand how this happened? In the first century, what happened is mainstream Jews picked on the early church, the people of the way like Paul. And then we came back and we became a dominant force and we came back with a vengeance. And that's what we did. There was a division between the followers of Jesus and the Jews over internal accepting of the Gentiles into the church. And all of a sudden, by the 2nd century, apostolic fathers like Pseudo-Barnabas wrote things like that the law was entirely symbolic. Sabbath wasn't a day of the week. Kosher wasn't about food. It's all about symbols. It's all about mysticism. And the early church began very early on, by its 2nd and 3rd century, writing things that didn't relate to the text or any literal understanding of it. It just became fanciful rewriting of truth. By the Synod of Elvira in 306, church members were told they couldn't eat with Jews. They certainly couldn't intermarry with one, even if that Jewish person had come to Christ. They were still Jewish, so you couldn't marry them. That's 306. The Council of Nicaea in 325 called the Jews evil and perverse. That's a way to win friends and influence people. John Chrysostom, called by the Orthodox Christians the Golden Mouth, offered sermons that called Jews lecherous, worthless, greedy, rapacious worshipers of the devil. That's bound to reach the community. Theodosius the Great expelled all the Jews from state positions in 379. By 613, Jews were commanded to be baptized in Spain or leave the country to cleanse the land. It was Martin Luther who in 1540 wrote concerning the Jews and their lies. said, I simply argue that Jews should be rounded up and their holy books should be taken away and they should be put in labor camps. It was quoted later on in Mein Kampf. See, before you walk around in a Jewish neighborhood acting like they're bothering you, you need to understand that there's a lot of blood in the background of this. We're not all wrong, but we're not all right either. Suffice it to say that the modern aversion to Israel is not just a political climate, it's rooted in a long history, and a lot of it was spiritual. You want to make me crazy? Pull me aside and tell me that you got the price down by Jewing the guy down. You don't think I hear Christians say it with regularity? You don't live south of the Mason-Dixon. Truth of the matter is, God's going to use the whole world to humble his people. He's going to use the whole world, and we cannot celebrate that reality. We can't claim to love God and then hate what he loves. Be careful not to stick a finger in the apple of God's eye. It's interesting because that principle doesn't only work for Israel, it also works for you. Nations can do whatever they want. When they turn against God's people, they start having problems they never saw coming. Stay tuned. Know this. God is going to do whatever it takes to break even his church to begin to follow him. The room got quiet. You know, proud and arrogant people don't reach out to Jesus for love. Strong Christians who are strong in their publishing houses, their seminaries, and their wealth and IRAs don't fall before Jesus. They stand strong because they accomplished so much. Honestly, let's just be gloves off honest. If Jesus gives us 10 more years in this country and he reopens the freedoms and the floodgates of freedom are open so that we are able to spread the gospel any way we want, tell me we're not going to market Jesus again. Tell me we're not going to build a bigger publishing house and just make more. The problem is I'm just not sure he can trust us with his own message. I think when you look at this, we have to understand he is shaping, molding, remolding, breaking. He's doing it in Israel. What makes you think he's not going to do it in his church? I'm convinced. I get to speak a lot of really great places. I enjoy being with you. And I get to be on platforms with guys who are really, really good. And you know what? I realize something. I realize that God gave to some people inordinate abilities because they know what to do with it, and I would mess it up if he gave it to me. I really believe that God can't always trust me with everything, and that's why he doesn't give it to me. How about you? I got a friend who God has dumped incredible wealth on. I don't know a more generous person in life. It's not a mystery to me why God gave it to him. Let me go on to verse 3 because I got to keep going. There's a stewarding principle here. The stewarding is that politically Jerusalem is a killer, but it's God's strong hand being used for a purpose. And even as God separates out people for a purpose, he puts his hand of protection on them to keep them in place. Don't get the feeling that God is just going to yank out Jerusalem and make them trouble, or yank out the Jewish people, make them trouble, yank out the believer in 21st century America and just not defend him and not watch over him and not care for him. He's not going to do that. His strong arm is both disciplinary and protective at the same time. So in verse 3 it says, it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all peoples. All who lift it will be severely injured. You know what that says? That says as the hour grows late, anybody who's really smart in politics will leave Jerusalem alone. You know why? Because you try lifting heavy stuff and it may not hurt you right then, but an hour later you're going to need some Advil. And there's a lot of political Advil that needs to be handed out to people who don't want to understand that God is serious when he says something. This is what he said in verse 4. In that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with bewilderment, his rider with madness. Wouldn't you like to see that? All of a sudden, the great armies of the world will be so able to deal with every conflict, but when they touch that one, they'll be befuddled and unable to get it together. You mean the Middle East conflict might get us embroiled in a war in Asia without an exit strategy and we might not know how to deal with it? How could that happen? News at 11. It says, I'll watch over the house of Judah while I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. In the middle of God's discipline, in your life, in their lives, in the middle of God's discipline, he never takes his hand off. One hand spanks, the other one holds the child in place so the child doesn't fall and get hurt. God knows what he's doing. You know, between 1933 and 1945, 67% of the Jewish population of the earth was destroyed. 67%. In some countries, the numbers were staggering. 90% of all Polish Jews were wiped out. 90% of Baltic Jews were killed. 88% of German Jewry was wiped out. 1 million Russian Jews perished. Would anybody have believed that when those things happened between 1933 and 1945, that in May 14th of 1948, David Ben-Gurion would stand in Tel Aviv and announce the approved proclamation of the establishment of the State of Israel? Would anybody have believed that? 67% of the Jewish population destroyed, but out of the ashes there rose a new thing. What I want you to understand is, yes, the ashes were real. Yes, they went through a horrible experience. And yes, God kept a hand of protection because he was working a plan. I don't understand all that. It doesn't always make sense to me why he does what he does. Any preacher that tells you otherwise is just flat out lying to you. We get the pieces of what God gives us, but the same God that did that for them is doing it for you as well. He's not a God of one nation, he's a God of all nations. His arm kept you from dangers untold. His arm kept you from perils that were unknown to you. You know, I don't know if you can do this, but I can look back on my life and find a lot of places where I really could have screwed it all up or ended it because of my own foolishness. And God was there to protect me. I didn't realize it at the time. It didn't mean he wasn't doing it. Would you be open to the idea that God doesn't need you to know what he's doing so that he's doing it? He can do it without your knowledge. Let me go on to verse 5, because in verse 5 there's a testimony principle. God is going to make it obvious to those who are watching closely that the protection of his people is a sign of his own hand at work. Look at verse 5. It says, the clans of Judah will say in their hearts, a strong support for us are the inhabitants of Jerusalem through the Lord of hosts, their God. You know what this says? This says that Jews around the world will spot Jews in Jerusalem. They will know that God is confounding those who want to take Jerusalem. They'll attack and try to deal with Jerusalem. They won't be able to do it. And Jews around the world will go, you know what? I wonder if there's not really a God. You know what? Maybe we ought to go back. Maybe this is real. Maybe the Bible is true. Maybe the prophecies concerning our people are real. There's a reason why America is turning away from the understanding that Israel is any more than a bunch of Jews complaining on a rock in the Middle East put together by a Zionist plot and a political movement. Because if it's not that, it might mean the Bible's true. And if the Bible's true, that's a real problem, because that means professors can't just sleep with their students. That's what it all comes down to. I'm in the universities. That's what it comes down to. It comes down to, I don't care if there's a God. I don't want there to be because I want to do what I want to do. That's your neighbor. They're not really worried about your intricate, incredible explanations of God and how he made the universe. They're worried about whether that means they can't sleep with whoever they want. That's what they're worried about. I love what Pastor Greg Greshel wrote in a recent message. He said, what's funny to me is, this is different than years past. He said, you know what? You can talk about God on TV. You can talk about spirituality. You can talk about karma, positive feelings coming your way right now. You can talk about any of those different things. But you know what you can't talk about? You can't talk about Jesus. Because when you talk about Jesus, everybody freaks out, he says. He says, I mean, even in public schools, you can't talk about Jesus. So he said, I just read the story the other day. There was a 4th grade little girl, and it was Easter time. And she came and she said, it's Easter, Jesus rose from the dead. And the teacher said, you can't talk about that in here. And she said, why not? Because Jesus rose from the dead. And she said, you Christians, you're so foolish. Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Roman soldiers stole the body of Jesus. She said, no, they didn't. The teacher said, prove it. She says, I can't, but here's what I know. When I get to heaven, I'm going to ask the Roman guards if they stole that body. Teacher said, well, what if the Roman guards aren't in heaven? She said, well, then you ask them when you get there. Don't think people are just mad because Christians have had the floor for so long and beaten down all the poor and unfortunate other religious groups. That's the line I hear in universities today. You guys have had the floor for so long and you've dominated everything and you've made it so bad and we want our freedom. We want to push off the yoke of Jesus. It's interesting. It's interesting the way this is played out. We're supposed to be the brutal religion. If that were true, I think we'd be reacting differently to people cutting heads off on beaches. Anyone who's watching fairly will be able to see a definite bias against the message of Jesus Christ, as though his message was driving modern terror movements or selfish endeavors. See, those who oppose God are going to increasingly notice something. God has a way of defending his own. He really does. He's going to confound the logic of the logical. There was a dear Baptist pastor, Gerald Steffi, who wrote, there was a man who worked for the post office whose job it was to process all the mail that had illegible addresses. One day a letter came to his desk. It was written in a shaky handwriting, but it was written to God. He thought, I better open this and see what this letter's about. He opened it and said, Dear God, I'm a 93-year-old widow living on a very small pension. Yesterday, someone stole my purse. It had in it $100, which is all the money I had until my next pension check. Next Sunday is Christmas. I invited my friends over for dinner. Without that money, I have nothing to feed them. I have no family to turn to. You're my only hope. Can you please help me? Sincerely, Edna. Now, the postal worker, he was touched, so he showed the letter to a couple of his fellows, and each one of the men and women back there behind the counter started to collect up money. They came up with $96, and they put it in an envelope. Gave it to the mail carrier. Mail carrier took it back to where the original letter came from. Christmas came and Christmas went. A few days later, another letter came with the shaky handwriting written to God. So it went back to his desk, and he read it, and it said, Dear God, how can I ever thank you enough for what you did for me? Because of your love, I was able to fix a glorious dinner for my friends. We had a very nice day. I told my friends of your wonderful gift. By the way, there's $4 missing. I think it's the thieves at the post office. I just want you to understand. People say what they think, not what is. In verse 7, it says the relatives of the Jewish people are going to notice that he saves the tents of Judah first. Here's what it says. It says that Jerusalem's going to be the problem, but God is going to save Jews in other pockets of the world before he saves Jerusalem, so that they are already aware that there's a God superintending the Jewish people. Verse 8 says that the people God is changing are going to notice. It says, in that day, the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the one who is feeble among them in that day will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, and the angel of the Lord before them. He says, I'm going to take the weakest person, the person you didn't think could do anything, and they're going to have a lion's heart within them. Why? Because I'm at work. Never believe that God can't use a small group of people to change the world, because that's all he ever did. In the history of mankind, it's always been a small... Have you ever really stopped to look at the motley crew that were the disciples? I mean, this half-baked Jewish dozen. Have you ever really looked at them? You got Peter over there. Ooh, I know. Usually he doesn't. And almost every time they open their mouth, all they're doing is putting their feet in it and chomping hard. And here's the thing. They're going into the upper room. Jesus is about to leave them. He spent 3.5 years with them. They're walking in the room, and they're going, I'm first. No, me. No, I'm me. I'm first. Oh, he touched me. Somebody, Jesus, he touched me. Oi. Would everybody please sit down? That's the introduction to the Last Supper. Or virtually every church meeting since. What I find interesting is that God doesn't bless us because of us. He blesses us in spite of us. Come on. Listen, I've been in church ministry for more than 30 years. We can foul up a 2-car parade. We don't have the ability to pull anything off. And then I lived a quarter of my life among Jews. I got to tell you, Israel, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Come on. This isn't about human strength. It's not about horses and chariots. It's interesting that verse 9 says even the enemies of God are going to notice when God steps in to do some testimony work. In that day I will set about to destroy all nations that come against Jerusalem. He says, there's coming a day when if you pick out my people, I'm going to pick out you. I'm going to know who you are. In that backroom deal that you do in Brussels, I know who you are. Don't think you're going to get away with that. See, at the end of life, I don't care how rich you are or how powerful, you still face a 6-foot hole. It is appointed unto man once to die, and then you meet your Creator. And I don't care how good a lawyer you were at The Hague, that's not going to out-talk. You cannot fast-talk. You cannot bamboozle an all-knowing God. So here's what I know. I know there's also a redemption principle. I love this principle. I love it because God's Spirit is going to transform the darkest part of men as they drop to their knees and surrender to the gospel. This is one of my favorite passages in all the Bible. In verse 10 it says, I'm going to pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem the Spirit of grace. May I just say this? I love Jerusalem. I love the Jewish people. Grace is not a word I would apply to them right now. They're not by nature gracious. My wife would go to the store. People don't cut in line. They knock you out of it. Shopping is a contact sport in Jerusalem. I'm serious. You think I'm kidding? It is a tough, tough place. I had a friend, Steve, who went to see the psychologist because every year your child graduates from one class to another. You got to go to a psychologist, send the child to a psychologist, then you have to have an interview. And the psychologist interviewed Steve's kid and said, I want you to know that your son is doing really well. When he gets pushed down, he pushes back. He knows how to cut in line. He knows how to get to be first. He's doing really well. We think he can advance to the next grade. And Steve sat there, having come from New York, horrified. He said, Doc, I got to tell you, what you just described, if it happened where I grew up, we'd be sending my child to reform school. And the doctor leaned into him and he said, Steve, your son must learn never to be a victim. If you understand that sentence, you understand the scar that is on the people that live there. I'm not going to knock you out of line because I'm uncaring. I'm going to knock you out of line because I think you might knock me out of line, so I'm going to be preemptive about it. Why? Because in my neighborhood, people with numbers on their arms aren't predisposed to think well of human nature. And they're not letting you get it over on them twice. This says, I'm going to pour grace on them. I'm going to pour grace. A heavy dose of grace dressing poured right over top of them. I'm going to sop them in grace. And verse 10 says, and supplication, so that they will look on him whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him. Who do you suppose will break through the clouds when their back is to the sea, and they cannot escape, surrounded by the nations of the world? Who do you suppose will look like one whom they have pierced? Who do you suppose is the identity of the one that will look like an only begotten son with piercings on his body? And they will bow to him, and they will say, we were wrong. That's why I love these verses. Because this is the verses of a national salvation of a broken-hearted people after a long tribulation nightmare. Now, here's the thing. Verse 10 goes on and says, they'll mourn as for an only son. They'll weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. They're going to love the fact that Jesus loves them, and they're going to hate the fact that they hated him. But you know what? They're not so different than you and I. We had a whole life before we met Jesus that pretty much spit in his eye every way we could. You go, I did not. I was very religious. That is one of the biggest spittle that you can put in his eye. Yes, I know you came and died, but I have so many good works that I can perform instead. You don't think that's a slap? Next time your mother-in-law invites you over for Thanksgiving, you bring the turkey. See how she's going to feel about the one she baked. You don't bring a different gift than the gift that's offered and think that's going to be well received. Look at verse 11. There's going to be great mourning. It's not only going to be in Jerusalem. Hadramon of the plain of Megiddo. See, all over the Middle East. Everywhere in the Middle East, there's going to be all kinds of trouble. It's not all going to be in one city. The whole Middle East will be engulfed in this because when Jesus comes, the Jewish people can have no other option, because if they have one other option, they'll try to take it. They got to be down to backed into the corner with no way out. Oh, listen, don't get all heady. So that's exactly like Randy. You think Jesus was my first choice? Randy was my first choice. My first choice was always whatever I felt like. How about yours? Come on, did you grow up? No, I grew up just seeking God. Are you serious? You didn't even live in my town. I have never met you. Verse 12 goes on and says the land is going to mourn. But listen, I want you to note in their Bible, every family by itself, the family of the household of David, that is the civil authorities, by themselves, with their wives by themselves. Why does he say that? That's weird. The family's going to do it by itself. By the way, the wives will be by themselves. But go on. It says family of Nathan. Now we're talking about prophets by itself, but the wives by themselves. Family of Levi, that is the priests, but the wives by themselves. What's he trying to say? He's trying to say that redemption is always, always an individual thing. It is never a household thing. Don't get caught up as he was saved and his house, as if because he was saved, his house was. You're not in a relationship with God because your mama was. You're not in a relationship with God because you have a Christian heritage in your nation. Mama's faith won't get you into heaven. Having fame and a publicist in this life rates you absolutely nothing in the next life. The fact of the matter is salvation is an individual thing. It's an individual affair. Some people think what they've accomplished for God ostensibly allows them to go to glory. They actually believe that their work for God is what gets them in. See, that's why I think the household of Nathan as a prophet is mentioned. No prophet will be able to claim that God used his mouth to say something significant and therefore he was able to get into heaven. His sin still has to take and be cared for separate from his ministry. Let me say it clearly. God's walk and work for God are not the same thing. There's a lot of people working for God that don't have a walk with him. I'm not saying they're not doing good things. Look, you can be a good person. Your next door neighbor can be a good person. The issue of salvation and justification is not goodness, it's righteousness. They're not the same thing. Righteousness is a judicial thing. Goodness is a character thing. You can be a good person. You can donate to the poor. You can do all kinds of loving acts to people. That doesn't make you righteous. It makes you good. And only righteousness walks through the door of heaven. What makes you righteous is the cleansing blood of Jesus that washes away your sin, because you can't earn God's salvation. You can only accept it. Here's the truth. Whether you're the house of Levi or whether you're the house of Nathan, whether you've been prophetic or priestly, holiness affronted cannot simply be ignored or outweighed by some act of goodness. No murderer is going to plead that he should get leniency because there were a lot of other people he wanted to kill, but he didn't, so they should give him a lesser sentence. It doesn't work that way. I got to tell you, I'm a little miffed at that. I personally believe that when I go on a diet, every time I don't eat a dessert, I should lose weight. What do you think? Just the denial act itself should allow me to drop a pound. Because I think that seems just. Doesn't it seem just to you? Look at verse 14. All the families that remain, every family by itself and their wives by themselves. See, this closes the simple fact that all of them mourn, all of them bow, every one of them, like Romans 11 says, all Israel will be saved. It's not simply God puts a rubber stamp on them because they were born with genetic tissue that says they're Jews and child of Abraham. They all get saved the same way you do, but all of them en masse bow at the same time. How cool is that? Every single Israelite will need to face their own sin. And the generations of great things that God did in their families will have no bearing on whether or not they'll do it. They'll do it because they see the one they pierced. And everybody's going to cry alone. Because I got to tell you, the sinfulness of each one of us really comes down to crying alone, doesn't it? Come on. Some of you have been married a long time. He doesn't know what you're thinking, ladies. Oh, come on now. I'm a guy. I can tell. He doesn't know what you're thinking. He doesn't even know how you think, let alone what you think. When we were first married, we were driving down the road. My wife was looking out the window. I was listening to a lecture on something in the Roman world. I shut it off because I thought, it looks a little rude. I really should be paying attention to my wife. It's a beautiful drive. I'm watching her, and she's smiling, and she's looking at the trees. She reaches over, and she grabs my hand. And I'm driving down the road, and I'm smiling, and I look at her, and I say, honey, what are you thinking about? And she says, I wonder if monkeys could live in those trees. Well, honey, we don't have any monkeys in this part of the world. No. I was watching a special on monkeys, and they would love these trees. For the rest of our married life, when I look at her, I say, we talking monkeys and trees here, or what are we doing? Now, I love my wife, but you have never met two people more different in the way we think. I get energized by a collegiate lecture on an obscure topic of Jews from the 8th century in Babylon. She watches the Three Stooges next to me. That's true. We sit there side by side. She's over there going, ah! I'm like, what is that? You know, I never laugh at the Jews in Babylon in the 8th century. They're just not all that funny. What I want you to understand is when I look down at this page, you know what I see? I see that a believer has to be governed by something that we've lost. Here's my heartbreak. My heartbreak is that in our society, they think that love is tolerance, but in Christianity, we forgot that God isn't primarily mercy, 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 love, love, love. He's primarily holy, holy, holy. If you don't tie yourself and your identity to Jesus Christ, let me tell you what's going to happen. You're either going to slide over into a list of legalism, or you're going to pendulum swing over here to the licentiousness and lawlessness of making up your own rules. Christianity can't be pulled off. There's not a Christian in this room that can pull off Christianity. Last week I preached a message, absolutely make no provision for the flesh. How you doing at that? Can anybody tell me how you do that in a buffet? How exactly do I walk through an American buffet and make no provision for the flesh? What does this mean? I should get bread and water and sleep on a bed of nails? What does it mean? It means that without the Spirit of God doing in me what I cannot do in myself, I'm either going to become some tough list legalist, or I'm going to become some loosey-goosey, licensed, licentious, loose-living person. Because I can't pull it off unless I'll yield my heart to God. Let me say it this way. I don't know where you've been. The goal of God in your life isn't to get you to get your list right. The goal of God in your life is intimacy with Him. You can have your list right and not be intimate with Him. Can we be honest enough? We're adults here. Can we be honest enough to say, you can stay married some days you just don't really feel like being married. So you can be in the relationship, but not be wanting to be in the relationship. Oh, I'm not talking about you're like looking at something bad or lusting. I'm just talking you just don't really feel like being with that person. There's more to marriage than love. There's also like. Come on, you know what I'm talking about here. So here's what I'm saying. The ultimate end goal of God isn't for you to just check off the list, go to work, get back on time, say all the right things, do all the right things, and stay away from all the big sins. That's not the goal here. The goal is that from the moment I get up in the morning till the moment I lay my head on my pillow, I have a walk of intimacy with Jesus Christ. That's the goal. And if you're not doing that, the rest of it's nonsense. Oh, I'm not saying go off in a life of sin. I'm saying you're already in one. Because self-will is the biggest sin we carry. Ultimately, when I understand, Christians are running around using this term unconditional acceptance. Are you kidding me? There's no such thing as unconditional acceptance. God's love for you is enduringly strong, but his expectation is that you'll change or you don't get a relationship with him. Is that clear to everyone? He's not going to negotiate that point. You know what? I got a special sinner section in heaven. You can go over to that one. Look at us. We're a mess. If you're not normally from here, watch your wallet. I know these folks. Here's what I can tell you about this room. We are not here because we're good. We're here because we're not. We're here because we understand what we need is the love of Jesus Christ to fill us up and the Spirit of God to change us and transform us. Because if he doesn't do this, we can't pull off a walk with God. And no amount of understanding, like I spend years and years and years studying the scriptures, and I got to tell you, that doesn't empower you to do everything right. Paul walked around saying, that which I would not, that do I do. A wretched man that I am, who is going to deliver me from this body of death? I keep doing stuff I don't want to do. Let's go back to the buffet. I keep doing stuff I don't want to do. You put more on the plate than you should. I put more on the plate than I should. There was a little boy named Nicholas, and he had a kindergarten Christmas program. And when he had his program, all the kids memorized little parts. Now, you've been to these Christmas programs before. Should I say you've endured these Christmas programs before? And so they gave out all of these placards, and the placard was supposed to say Christmas love, and everybody got Christmas love. They got a C. And so they learned verses for all of this, and C comes up, and C is for Christ, and they all together give a wonderful verse, and H is for, and then they all give a verse, and they do this all the way down the line. Well, everybody was doing really well, all the way through until they got to the M, C, H-R-I-S-T, but the M was upside down. Now, the little girl was very proud. M is for Mary, and they went on and told them, but she had a W, and she's standing there proudly holding a W where it should be an M. And the kids are giggling, and they're going, it's Susie. But they just keep right on going. They get all the way to the end of love. And it's not until the end of the program that everybody stops and looks at it, and it says, Christ was love. That's what it said. And the room grew silent because they understood. That little girl told them a truth they weren't ready to hear, but they needed to know. I need you to understand something. Long before you knew it, long before you ever had any idea God was at work in your life, and whether Israel is following God today, right now, or not, and by the way, they're not, here's what I know. God is at work in them, doing something because the end of the story is already written. And they're going to show up at the right time, and they're going to do the right thing, not because they're so good at it or because they rehearsed. They're going to hold the card upside down, but they're going to get the message right. Father, thank you this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to take a look at a passage of Scripture and just remind ourselves how much we need you. It would be easy for us to turn this prophecy thing into something of a distant people, of a long ago and far away place, and not make this personal. The fact of the matter is there's nobody in this room that doesn't understand exactly what it is you want from us. You want intimacy with us. You want to walk with us. You want us to be in your life, and you want to be in our lives, and you want us to tie those things together. You don't want me to dive into your word so I can get a list. You want me to dive into your word because I love you and I want to hear what you have to say. God, help us. Help us not to put on a religious show or a dance. That's not worthy of you. Help us to be honest. There's not a person in this room that isn't broken. And we need you this morning to change us, transform us, work in us by the power of the Spirit of God and the truth of the cleansing that comes from the blood of Jesus Christ. It's in his name we pray. Amen.